The day Cecily Vane was pushed into the lake at Ashworth Manor, no one moved to help her. They stood there, the lords and ladies of 3 counties, silk-gloved hands covering silk-gloved smiles, and watched her sink beneath the surface of that cold green water. They watched Lady Philippa Ashworth brush imaginary water from her own ivory skirts, smile sweetly at the Duke standing 10 feet away, and say, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh dear." The poor creature lost her footing. She had not lost her footing. Cecily had felt the hands. 2 firm palms pressed flat against her shoulder blades, the force deliberate, the timing chosen for maximum audience. One moment she had been standing at the edge of the ornamental lake admiring the water lilies, and the next she was beneath them, her dress ballooning around her, her mouth filled with dark water. Her ears filled with the muffled sound of laughter. She would remember, in the years that followed, exactly what it felt like to sink. The shocking cold. The green silence. The way the sky looked from below, distant, bright, impossibly far. She would also remember exactly what it felt like to decide, somewhere in that cold and quiet, that she would not stay down. What no one at that garden party could have predicted was how completely she would rise. Not just from the water. From everything they had made of her. From the quiet ruin they had built around her name and called it kindness. This is the story of Cecily Vane. And of the Duke who should have saved her, and instead looked away. She had come to Ashworth Manor as a guest of charity, and she had always known it. Her father, the late Mr. Edmund Vane, had been a man of modest scholarship and immodest debts, a gentle soul who had loved books more than ledgers and paid for it accordingly. When he died, he left Cecily a small library, a leaking cottage in Derbyshire, and a letter of introduction to the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, who had been a distant school friend of Cecily's mother and who felt, in her softer moments, a vague but genuine sense of obligation. So Cecily had arrived at Ashworth Manor the previous autumn, 23 years old, dark-haired, quietly composed, wearing a grey dress that was clean and careful and 2 seasons behind fashion. The Dowager had been genuinely kind to her. The servants had been professionally polite. And Lady Philippa, the Duke's chosen fiancée, had been precisely, unfailingly cruel in the way that only very beautiful, very secure women ever learn to be. Philippa Ashworth was the daughter of an earl, possessed of a fortune, a face like a portrait, and an instinct for hierarchy as finely tuned as any hunting dog's. She had identified Cecily within the first hour as a threat of no particular consequence and had proceeded to treat her as one nonetheless, with the particular cruelty of someone who enjoys the exercise even when it costs nothing. The Duke himself, Adrian Whitmore, 5th Duke of Ashworth, had barely registered Cecily's existence. She had seen him across rooms. She had stood in doorways he walked through without noticing. She had handed him a book he had dropped in the library one grey afternoon and he had taken it with a murmured thank you in the blank civil expression of a man receiving a service from a person whose face he would not remember. He was not unkind, precisely. He was simply absent. Even when present, he was absent, tall, dark-suited, composed with the rigid composure of a man who had somewhere along the way confused self-control with self-erasure. He ran his estates with precision. He attended his social obligations with discipline. He was engaged to Philippa because his solicitor had advised it and his mother had arranged it and he had found no sufficient reason to object. He had not, at any point, looked at Cecily Vane with anything that might be called seeing. And so when it happened, when Cecily stood at the edge of the ornamental lake on that warm June afternoon, and Philippa appeared at her side with that smile, and the 2 hands pressed and pushed, the Duke's first instinct was to believe what he was told. Poor creature lost her footing. He had watched 2 footmen pull her out. He had watched her stand on the grass, streaming and shaking, her dark hair plastered to her white face, her dignity somehow still intact in the most devastatingly quiet way. He had watched Philippa take his arm and steer him gently back toward the party, chattering about the weather. He had not gone to her. He had not asked if she was injured. He had not, to his own later shame, done anything at all. That evening, he was told that Miss Vane had quietly gathered her belongings and departed Ashworth Manor without a word of farewell to anyone but the Dowager and the housekeeper. He had felt a mild and passing discomfort, the kind one feels upon learning a bird has struck a window, and then let it go. It would be 18 months before he understood what he had allowed to happen. 18 months before he rode up the drive of Thornfield Park, his neglected, near-ruined northern estate, and found something he had not, in his most private imaginings, anticipated. But that understanding would have to be earned. And earning it would cost him considerably. The dowager had given Cecily the position out of guilt, and Cecily accepted it out of necessity, and neither of them spoke of either fact. Thornfield Park was one of several Ashworth properties, technically. In practice it was closer to an architectural apology, a manor house in the Yorkshire moors that had been left largely unoccupied for 7 years. Staffed by a skeleton crew of loyal and quietly desperate servants, and managed by correspondence by a steward named Mr. Greer, who drank too much and recorded too little. The dowager had offered Cecily the position of companion housekeeper, a title invented on the spot that meant she would receive room, board, a modest quarterly allowance, and the authority to attempt whatever improvements she could in exchange for keeping the property from falling into complete dereliction. "It is not much," the dowager had said, pressing Cecily's hands in hers with genuine apology in her eyes. "It is a great deal more than what I had," Cecily had replied, and meant it. She had arrived at Thornfield Park on a cold November morning, in a hired cart, with 1 trunk and 2 shillings. The drive was overgrown with dead brambles. The front steps were cracked. One of the upstairs windows was boarded with timber gone grey with weather. A thin column of smoke rose from what she hoped was the kitchen chimney. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, met her at the door. She was a stout woman in her 60s with the cautious eyes of someone who had been disappointed frequently and had not yet made her peace with it. "You'll want to see the state of the place, then," Mrs. Alderton said, by way of greeting. "I will," said Cecily. The state of the place was bad. The east wing was uninhabitable due to a collapsed ceiling. The kitchen stove required replacement or significant repair. The walled garden was a ruin of dead stalks and freezing mud. 3 of the remaining servants, 2 maids, an elderly groundskeeper, had not been paid in 6 weeks because Mr. Greer had been, it emerged, systematically pocketing the management funds and gambling them at a coaching inn 4 miles away. Cecily read through what remained of the estate accounts in 2 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table by candlelight with a cup of tea and an expression of complete, focused calm. Then she wrote 3 letters, one to Mr. Greer, informing him of his dismissal, one to the dowager's solicitor, itemizing the misappropriated funds and requesting a recovery, and one to a builder in the nearest town, asking for an estimate on the east wing ceiling before the first heavy snowfall made the damage permanent. Mrs. Alderton watched all of this from the kitchen doorway with a growing, careful attention, the way a woman watches something she is not yet willing to believe in. "You're not what I expected," she said on the 3rd day. "What did you expect?" Cecily asked, not looking up from the ledger she was correcting. "Someone quieter," Mrs. Alderton said. Cecily allowed herself, very briefly, to smile. "I was quiet," she said. "It didn't serve me. The winter was brutal and the resources were thin, and there were mornings when the cold inside the house was indistinguishable from the cold outside it." But Cecily learned the names of every servant. She learned which floorboards were safe, which chimneys drew properly, which rooms held warmth and which bled it. She bartered the estate's surplus timber with a local carpenter for labor. She planted the first beds of the kitchen garden herself, in February, while the ground was still half frozen. Because the growing season in Yorkshire was short and she did not intend to waste a single week of it. And slowly, stubbornly, Thornfield began to breathe again. By spring, the east wing ceiling was repaired. By early summer, the walled garden was producing kale, onions, early peas, and more herbs than the household could use, the surplus of which Cecily began exchanging with the village at the bottom of the hill, establishing a quiet but useful relationship with the families there. She had also, quietly, and without announcement, opened the upper servants' quarters to 2 children. Tom and Nell Briggs were the grandchildren of the elderly groundskeeper, Robert Briggs, a widower who had kept his position at Thornfield through sheer stubbornness and had been managing the grounds alone and on reduced wages for 3 years. When Cecily learned that the children's mother, his daughter, had died the previous winter, and that Tom was 12 and Nell was 9 and both were sleeping in a single room above the stables, she had without ceremony moved them both into the warmest upstairs rooms and told Mrs. Alderton to see to it that they were fed properly. Mrs. Alderton had looked at her with an expression that was not quite tearful and very nearly warm. "The Duke's solicitor may not approve," she had said. The Duke's solicitor is welcome to ride 4 hours north and tell me so in person, Cecily had said pleasantly, and that had been the end of the discussion. The children were a revelation. Tom was serious and capable and learned to maintain the estate accounts almost without being taught. He had a numerical mind that reminded Cecily of something valuable. Nell was imaginative and sometimes infuriating and kept a collection of stones on the windowsill of her room, each one found in a different part of the estate grounds. Each one catalogued with a stub of pencil in a small notebook Cecily had given her. The village began to know Cecily by name. Not as Miss Vane of Thornfield, but as Cecily, the woman who had hired 3 local men to repair the east wing and paid them fairly and on time. The woman who had established a lending arrangement of seed stock that had saved 2 tenant farms from a poor planting season. The woman who walked the moorland paths in all weather and always had something civil and genuine to say to whoever she met on them. None of this was ambition. It was simply what the situation required of a person paying attention. What Cecily did not allow herself, in this period, was grief. Not for her father. Not for the humiliation at the lake, which she had replayed enough times in her first weeks that she had decided replaying it served no purpose and sealed it away somewhere unreachable. Not for the future she had once imagined for herself, small and modest as it had been, bookish, warm, companionable, the future that felt very distant now. She had been pushed. She had risen. The details after that were simply survival wearing the clothes of purpose. She did not think about the Duke. Or rather, she refused to. Adrian Whitmore arrived at Thornfield Park on an afternoon in late September, unannounced, on horseback. In the company of 1 manservant and a letter from his solicitor that had alarmed him sufficiently to make the journey north in 3 days rather than the customary 5. The letter had contained a detailed accounting of the estate's improvement, the recovery of the misappropriated funds, a series of repairs documented with uncommon precision. And a note from his mother that said, simply, "You should go and see what she's made of it. I suspect you will find it instructive." He had not expected instruction. He had expected, if he was honest, some combination of muddle and modest effort, the sort of thing that required patience to acknowledge and careful management to correct. What he found instead made him stop his horse at the end of the drive and sit very still for a long moment. The drive itself was clear, the edges trimmed, the gravel raked. The front steps were repaired. The windows were clean. Beyond the south side of the house, visible over the garden wall, he could see the late-season kitchen garden still producing, rows of root vegetables in good order. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys in a way that suggested they were being used efficiently, not profligately. 2 chickens crossed the drive ahead of him with the confident air of animals that belong exactly where they are. A boy appeared from the stables before his manservant had quite finished dismounting, dark-haired, serious-faced, quick-eyed, and took the reins of Adrian's horse with a competence that was entirely automatic. "You'll be the Duke, then," the boy said. Adrian blinked. "I am." "Miss Vane's inside," Tom said, and led the horse away without further ceremony. The housekeeper met him in the hall, clean, warm, smelling of beeswax and something herbal, with a correctness of manner that contained, he felt, a quiet but definite reserve. He was shown to the drawing-room and offered tea, which arrived promptly and was notably good, and he sat with it for 7 minutes before Cecily Vane appeared in the doorway. He almost didn't recognize her. Not because she had changed in any dramatic exterior sense, she was still the same woman, dark hair pinned simply, gray dress replaced by a deep blue wool that fit her properly, face composed. But the quality of her stillness was entirely different. A year ago, the stillness had been a kind of absence, the careful stillness of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. This was something else. This was the stillness of someone who knew exactly where they stood. She looked at him the way she might look at a moderately interesting problem, with a measured attention that gave nothing away. "Your Grace," she said. "I wasn't informed you were coming." "I came unannounced," he said. "I apologize for the imposition." "It is your house," she said evenly. "You require no apology." There was nothing in the words that could be objected to. There was everything in the tone that could not be ignored. He was being reminded, with perfect politeness, that he was a stranger here. He had not expected to feel that. He found, to his considerable unease, that he felt it deeply. He intended to stay 3 days. He stayed a fortnight. There was no single reason for it. The riding was good. The accounts genuinely required his attention, and Cecily had organized them so clearly that reviewing them with her present was far more efficient than reviewing them alone. The East Wing, now repaired, needed decisions about what should be done with the rooms. These were reasonable justifications. What he did not say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that he kept finding reasons to remain in the same rooms as Cecily Vane, watching her, trying to solve the particular puzzle of her. She was unfailingly correct toward him. She answered every question with precision. She offered information without being asked when it was relevant and withheld it without rudeness when it was not. She did not seek his approval. She did not flinch from his presence. She moved through the house as if she had always lived there and he had come to visit. At dinner on the fourth evening, he said, "You've done remarkable work here." She glanced at him briefly over her soup. "The house required work. I had time." "You had more than time," he said. "The walled garden alone, old Briggs taught me the soil," she said. "I provided the organization. He provided the knowledge. Most of what's been accomplished here has been the result of working with what was already present." She returned to her soup with an efficiency that was clearly not dismissal and was clearly also not invitation. That evening, walking the South Gardens in the late autumn dusk, he came across the small girl, Nell, he had learned, sitting on a stone bench with her notebook. Cataloging her stones with the focused intensity of a naturalist, a candle lantern placed beside her though it was not quite dark enough to need it. "You're the Duke," Nell said. "So I've been told today," he said. "Miss Vane says you're to be treated with courtesy." "That is very thoughtful of her." "She says that about everyone," Nell said, with the devastating honesty of a 9-year-old. "Even Mr. Hartley from the village, who she privately thinks is a great bore." Despite himself, Adrian laughed. It was a short, unpracticed sound, like something that had not been used in some time. The following morning, he asked Cecily directly about the children. She told him the circumstances plainly and without apology, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that challenged him to object if he intended to. He did not object. "They should be educated," he said instead. Something shifted in her expression, not softening, exactly, but a slight recalibration. "Yes," she said carefully. "They should." "I'll make arrangements," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That would be a good thing," she said, and the restraint in the words was, he was beginning to understand, the highest form of approval she currently offered him. He found he wanted more of it than a man in his position had any logical reason to want. 3 things happened in the second week that rearranged the internal geography of Adrian Whitmore's understanding. The first was the letter. He was in the study reviewing correspondence when he came across a note, accidentally included in a bundle from the solicitor, from Philippa. She was writing, cheerfully, with no apparent awareness of irony, to ask whether the house at Thornfield might be suitable for use as a hunting party venue the following season. She referred to it as that dreary northern pile, and suggested it might benefit from redecoration by someone with actual taste. He sat with the letter for a long time. He thought about the garden wall and the clean windows and the boy who took his horse with the gravity of a professional. He thought about what Philippa had done at the lake, which he had, he now understood, allowed himself not to think about very directly or very long. He had looked away. The fact of it was like a stone in his chest. The second thing was the storm. It arrived in the night on the 11th day, a full Yorkshire autumn storm, the kind that comes in low and fast and means precisely what it says. Adrian was awake before dawn, listening to it rattle the repaired east wing shutters, when he heard movement in the corridor and found Cecily fully dressed. Moving quietly from room to room with a lantern, checking the ceiling joins in the new plasterwork, making sure the repair held. She didn't hear him until she turned and found him standing in the doorway of the east corridor. She didn't startle. She simply looked at him in the lantern light, her face drawn with something he recognized, distantly, as anxiety that had been converted into action rather than expressed, and said, "The east gable. I'm not certain the flashing was done well enough." "Show me," he said. They went up together in the dark, in the roaring cold noise of the storm, and checked the flashing together, and found it was holding but marginally. And he went back downstairs and brought more rags and they packed the gap together, side by side on their knees, in the cold attic, by lantern light, while the storm screamed overhead. Afterward, coming down the back stairs, she said quietly, "I was afraid this would happen." I pushed the builder to finish before the season turned. The repair is sound, he said. You made the right choice. She glanced at him sideways, a brief, private look that he thought contained, somewhere inside it, a small unlocking. Thank you, she said. Meaning it. The third thing was what old Briggs told him the following morning in the stable yard. Without any particular prompting and with the bluntness of a very old man who has decided he no longer needs to be tactful. She came here with nothing, Briggs said, brushing down one of the horses with rhythmic patience. Freezing cold, November, 2 shillings in her pocket and that leather trunk. Paid us all before she paid herself. Went without coal in her own room for 6 weeks to make sure the kitchen stayed warm. Never said a word about it. Mrs. Alderton only knew because she went to put coal in herself and found the scuttle empty. Adrian was quiet. She told the children she was their grandmother's old friend, Briggs said, so they wouldn't feel they owed her anything. The stone in Adrian's chest shifted. He understood, with the specific and uncomfortable clarity of a man who has been avoiding a conclusion, that what had happened to Cecily Vane at that garden party had not been an accident. That he had watched it happen. That he had believed what Philippa told him because it was convenient to believe it. And that convenience had cost this woman the entire previous 18 months of cold and struggle and 2 shillings. He stood in the stable yard for a long time after Briggs went inside. The crisis arrived in the form of a man named Lord Carver. He appeared on a Tuesday, in a hired carriage, with a solicitor at his elbow and a document that he presented to Cecily in the front hall with the satisfied air of someone who has been waiting a long time to do exactly this. The document claimed a boundary dispute between Thornfield's southernmost acreage and Carver's neighboring estate, a dispute that, if upheld, would sever the access road to the lower tenant farms and render 2 of the most productive fields legally inaccessible, effectively gutting the estate's agricultural income. Cecily read the document carefully while Carver watched her with the expression of a man who expects a woman alone to either collapse or capitulate. She did neither. She said, "I'll need until Thursday to respond properly. Please leave a direction where your solicitor can be reached." When they were gone, she went to the study and began pulling the original estate survey documents, which she had reorganized the previous spring when she had been sorting and cataloging the neglected records, and found. Within 2 hours, the counter-document she was looking for, a boundary agreement from 1803, signed and sealed, that placed the disputed acreage unambiguously within the Ashworth estate's legal bounds. She was still reading when Adrian came to the study doorway. "Carver," he said. His voice was flat in a way that told her this was not a new name to him. "You know him. He has been attempting to acquire that southernmost acreage for 4 years, Adrian said. My previous steward, Greer, before your time, appears to have been in preliminary correspondence with him about a potential sale." The implication was clear and unpleasant. Cecily laid the 1803 document on the desk between them. "Then I think you'll be glad I kept the archives in order," she said. He looked at the document. Then he looked at her. The expression on his face was something she had not seen from him before, not the polite blankness, not the reserved acknowledgement, but something rawer. Something that sat at the junction of gratitude and shame. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Just her name, without prefix, without ceremony. She felt it somewhere beneath her composure and chose not to show it. "We should send to your London solicitor immediately," she said. "I'll draft the letter if you'll sign it." "Yes," he said. He didn't move for a moment. "Thank you. It's my home," she said quietly. And then, hearing herself, looked faintly surprised. He did not miss it. They sent the letter that evening. The following day, they rode together to the southern boundary to document the markers, a practical necessity that became, in the cold bright October air, something else entirely. They rode in silence mostly, but it was the first silence between them that felt like company rather than distance. Halfway along the boundary line, he stopped his horse and looked out across the moors, the enormous, rolling, pitiless and beautiful moors, and said, without looking at her, "I fought in Portugal. For 2 years. I came back and I found my father had died, my brother had made a significant mess of the London house finances, and everyone expected me to simply continue. As if nothing had occurred." She waited. "I became very good," he said, "at not allowing things to matter. It seemed efficient. I have recently been given to understand it is not a virtue. She considered him for a long moment. The gray sky. The way he held himself, still that rigid composure, but fractured at the edges now, the fractures showing. It kept you alive, she said. The not allowing things to matter. In a war, it would have. Yes, he said. But I came home. Yes, she said softly. You did. That was all. They rode on. But something in the quality of the space between them had changed its character irreversibly, and both of them felt it. The engagement to Philippa was dissolved the following week. The announcement came in a letter to Adrian from Philippa's father, the Earl, who had apparently learned, through sources Adrian did not entirely trace, that the boundary dispute had been resolved and that Thornfield Park was in rather better order than its reputation had suggested, and who had apparently reassessed the strategic value of the match and found it somewhat diminished by Philippa's continued insistence on referring to it as that drafty northern inconvenience. Adrian told Cecily at dinner. She absorbed this with the same measured attention she gave most information. Then she said, "Are you grieved by it?" He considered the question honestly. "No," he said. "I am relieved in the way one is relieved by the removal of an obligation one should never have accepted." She was quiet. "I accepted it," he said, "because it was arranged and convenient and my mother approved, and I had long since stopped asking myself whether I felt anything in particular about anything." He paused. That was not fair to Philippa, either. Cecily looked at him with that clear, unhurried gaze. "No," she agreed. "It was not." "She pushed you into the lake," he said. The words came out with difficulty, as if they had been waiting in a narrow space. The silence was very complete. "Yes," Cecily said. I looked away. She said nothing. She waited. "I told myself it was an accident," he said. "I believe I knew it was not. I believe I chose not to examine it because examining it would have required me to do something that was disruptive and uncomfortable and might have cost me the engagement and the arrangement and the continued smooth operation of my life." He looked at his hands. "That is not a defense. It is simply what happened." Cecily set down her fork with a precise, careful movement. "I went into that water," she said, "and I decided, somewhere in the dark of it, that I would not organize my survival around what you did or failed to do. I couldn't. It would have made everything I built here contingent on something outside myself." "Yes," he said. "So I built it for its own sake," she said. "For the children. For Briggs. For Mrs. Alderton and the village and the garden and the leaseholders on the lower farms." She met his eyes steadily. "Not for you." "I know," he said. "I need you to understand that clearly," she said. "Before anything else is said." "I do understand it," he said. "More clearly than I have understood anything in some time." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the moorland with its particular low voice. The candle light between them was very steady. "What will you do now?" she asked. "You are free of the engagement. The estate is in order. Your solicitor will be satisfied. You have very little reason to remain." He looked at her directly. "I find," he said, "that I have every reason to remain. If I am permitted." Her expression did not change, quite. But her eyes did, something in them that was not quite warmth yet, but was the exact quality of attention that precedes warmth. The careful, watchful attention of someone who has been cold for a long time and is not yet certain they can afford the risk of warmth but is considering it seriously and honestly. "You would need to earn it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking for the opportunity." She picked up her fork. She ate in silence for a moment. Then she said, "The south kitchen garden needs a proper cold frame before winter sets in properly. I have been told you're reasonably competent with basic construction." He blinked. "By whom?" "Your manservant is somewhat indiscreet," she said. There was something in the edge of her voice that was not quite a smile and was also unmistakably one. "I can build a cold frame," he said. "Then," she said, "you can start tomorrow morning." He started tomorrow morning. He spent 3 days on it, longer than necessary for a man of his position, precisely the right amount of time for a man who was rebuilding something more than a kitchen garden. Cecily brought him tea on the second afternoon and did not say anything particularly meaningful, and he did not say anything particularly meaningful, and both of them understood it entirely. Nell catalogued the new woodwork in her notebook as an event of significance. Tom noted, with serious approbation, that the mitered corners were done properly. Old Briggs said nothing, but was observed to be faintly satisfied in the vicinity of the finished cold frame. And in the weeks that followed, the cold weeks, the good weeks, the weeks of shared work and careful proximity and honest words exchanged across the study table and the dinner table and the moorland path and the kitchen garden, something was built that did not need to be named to be understood. It grew in the manner of things that are built well, which is to say quietly, and with strong materials, and with the patience of people who have both learned, in their different ways, that things built badly fall apart. On the last day of October, a clear cold day with the moor grass gone gold and the sky the color of polished pewter, they walked the southern boundary together, not to check the markers this time, but simply because it was where they both, without discussion, turned their steps. Partway along, he stopped. She stopped beside him. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to say this properly. I have not managed to arrive at a satisfactory phrasing." She waited. "What you have made of Thornfield," he said, "is what a home is." "I had forgotten, I am not certain I knew what that was. What it felt like. To be in a place where you are known. Where what you do matters. Where there are children and animals and cold frames and arguments about whether the north chimney draws better with the door open or closed, and all of it is real." He paused. "I would like, if you will have me, to be part of what is real here." She was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the moors. The wind moved her hair against her cheek. "You looked away at the lake," she said. "I want you to understand that I know that. That I will always know that. That it does not go away." "Yes," he said. "I know. And I want you to understand," she said, "that I rose anyway. Not because of you. In spite of you, at first. And then simply because it was mine to do." "I know that too," he said. "It is why, among all the reasons, it is the first reason, I am asking." She turned her face toward him, out of the wind. Her expression was contained and honest and held, at its center, something that was both grief and resolution, the expression of a woman who has examined something clearly and made her peace with it and is choosing, with full knowledge, to choose. "You may stay," she said. "If you earn it." "Each day." "Each day," he agreed. "Yes." He reached out and took her hand, very carefully, with the gravity of someone who understands the significance of what they are being given. She let him. Around them, the moors were vast and cold and completely indifferent, as they had been when she arrived with 2 shillings and a trunk, as they would be long after both of them were gone. But at the center of that vast indifference, there was the manor on the hill with smoke from 2 chimneys and a kitchen garden and a child's notebook full of catalogued stones and a cold frame built with careful mitered corners, and it was warm. It was warm because she had made it warm, and now there were 2 of them to keep it so. She had been pushed into the water. She had risen. And everything, slowly, stubbornly, completely, had changed. Not because he had saved her. Because she had saved herself. And in doing so, had made something worth saving him for. And so ends the story of Cecily Vane, the woman who rose from the lake and built a home out of a ruin, a life out of very little, and a love out of honesty and earned trust. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath alongside her in that cold autumn water, we would love to know. Leave us a comment below and tell us which moment stayed with you longest. If you're new here, please subscribe. We have so many more stories of quiet courage, unlikely love, and heroines who rise. Share this with someone who loves a romance that takes its time and gets it right. We'll see you in the next chapter.